All right, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Words of the Wise. Today I have Chief Gaines from Lansing Community College PD in Michigan. He spent 20 years at Baltimore PD. He was on patrol and narcotics enforcement. He rose through the ranks, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, major. He retired in 2021 with the rank of major, and also in 2021, he accepted the position as chief of police for his existing agency, Lansing Community College PD. And that was about 5 years ago. I had to do math. So 5 years ago. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think that there were a lot of things that we really aligned on when it comes to wellness. So welcome to the show, Chief Gaines. Thank you so much for being here today.
For having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I was doing quick math and I was like, okay, so he's been chief for 5 years, new
Yeah,
agency, but I was really interested. You spent a lot of time at Baltimore PD. That is a big metro,
yeah,
high crime, a lot of volume, a lot
mhm,
of things going on. So, what
yeah.
was your time like in Baltimore, especially as a young officer, kind of rising through the ranks and spending the bulk of your career there?
Yeah, well, really from the beginning, um, I didn't feel like it was a disadvantage, but because I don't have a military background, and a lot of officers, especially in Baltimore, a lot of the officers that come through have a military background. This was just, the profession itself was literally brand new to me.
Mm.
Um, I graduated the academy in like the last week of August of 2001. And I was supposed to have, 16 weeks of field training before I started going out patrolling on my own. But as you're aware, and the rest of the world is aware, literally a week into my field training, we have 9/11.
Mm.
And so I didn't get field training. I literally got maybe like 6 days of field training before 9/11 happens. And now, you know, it ends up that they need officers on the street and they can't afford to have officers occupied with trainees. And so they end up throwing keys at all of us and saying, here's a cross street map. Here's a set of keys. We need cops.
Wow.
The world is the country is under attack, and so I had to really sort of find my way and figure out my way on the fly on how to really do this job and survive in this job. Um, and so the first year was really kind of rough. I mean, I was in a brand new city. I'm not from Baltimore. I'm from New Jersey. And so I was still in the process of trying to learn the city itself, just learn Baltimore. And now here I am having to answer calls for service and go to places that I'm not familiar with. I'm asking the dispatcher for cross streets for the cross streets. I
Wow.
mean, it was just crazy. I can tell you the very first call I ever went on. It took me an hour. The place, I think the location was maybe 15 minutes from the station. And I think I finally pulled up to the location like an hour later, and my entire squad was there. They gave me a standing ovation when I finally arrived. And we didn't have GPS and all the other tech stuff back then. So literally, it's a stack of papers with a bunch of cross streets off the main thoroughfares, and you got to try to figure out your way. So that first year was rough, but once I settled in, I kind of realized that this was good. I mean, I knew I was in a very violent city. I knew I was in a very large and a very busy police department. But what better place to learn how to really do the job and do the job effectively? So I kind of dove in head first. I spent my first couple of years working the midnight shift, which, from a wellness standpoint, that can be difficult.
Mm.
We're out working on the midnight shift when most of the rest of the world is sleeping. And so you can imagine how that can play sometimes on your body, and how it can play on your sleep patterns and things like that. So, I managed my way through there, and I think I did pretty well with it. And spent about 2.5 years in patrol, and I did some pretty good work. And lo and behold, narcotics sees the work I'm doing, and they decide to pull me for that. And so I ended up spending some years doing narcotics and working in a violent crime impact division. You can imagine. I mean, Baltimore has some of the most hardened criminals in the country, probably in the world. And so those kinds of units are really, really important to, departments like that. We do a lot of the hard case work. And so I think I probably got to around 2007. And, at the time I was married. I had, by then I was married and had two young children. I had I think probably my oldest daughter was, she had to be maybe 4 at the time. I think my youngest daughter was probably around 2. You start getting to that point in your career where you got to make decisions. And I had to decide if I was just going to continue making lateral moves, narcotics to robberies or wherever, or was I going to start ascending vertically through the department where I can actually affect some change and actually have some, because, all along the way, my first few years, I was seeing things that they just looked out of whack to me, things that were going on that probably shouldn't have been going on. Um, Even the way we were policing, a lot of those things I was kind of looking at and saying, well, we really should be doing this way. We shouldn't be doing this things that way. But the only way you can really affect change is to start moving up. And so right around 2007, I had never intended on, taking a promotional test, before I had children. I just, my path was, hey, I'll just bounce around. I'll be a cop. I love doing narcotics. I love doing those kinds of investigations. I had no aspirations to start moving vertically through the department. But when I started realizing that, there was some change that I was hoping to see, be a lot easier to affect that change if I started taking promotional exams.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I did. I took the promotional exam for sergeant in 2007. You can imagine how big our promotional lists are. I mean, at the time we were a 3,000 officer police department. So, when I took my sergeant's exam, I took the exam with, 1,100 other officers that had aspirations to move to sergeant. I ended up, I think I did pretty good for my first time. I landed like number 60 on the list out of, I think, like 800.
Wow.
And the list is always, all the promotional lists are good for 2 years. And so in the second year of the list, I ended up getting promoted to sergeant. And that's really when I started to see things from a different view. You start seeing things from 1,000-foot view rather than from the ground level. And I started seeing where I can do some things to change some things. But even at that, first level of that first line supervisor level, there's only so much you can do to affect change. You can affect it within your immediate squad, but it's difficult to have a sort of an overreaching effect. And so I think at that point I had just made the decision that, look, I'm just going to continue to ascend as high as I can, and the higher up I go, the more ability I'll have to try to do things better and do things the right way. So I think I spent 8 years at sergeant, and then I was promoted to lieutenant. I think I spent 2 years as a lieutenant. A shift commander over patrol, and then when I was a lieutenant, I got moved back into to narcotics and was the commanding officer for the entire operations unit of the Western District. Yeah, I know you're probably not that familiar with how the districts run in Baltimore, but they're basically, the city is broken down into 9 districts.
Okay.
And so every district is almost like its own police station under this big umbrella of the Baltimore City Police Department. And so the Western District is where we had the civil unrest, the Freddie Gray situation. And so after that had happened and I got promoted to lieutenant, they moved me over to the Western District to try to help, mend some of the police community relations over there. So I, spent about 2 years, 2.5 years maybe as lieutenant. And then the police commissioner appointed me to captain, and moved me over to the Central District, which is the Central District of Baltimore is really the most complex and challenging district in Baltimore City. We have a very large touristy section, which is downtown Baltimore, where the Inner Harbor is, and some of these other tourist attractions. But we also have other sections of that district that are very violent, where we experience a lot of violent crime. And so I became the captain of the Central District. I think that was around 2018, or yeah, like 2017, 2018. I think I got that promotion, and I was only a captain for maybe 4 months before my major, who was my direct supervisor, he ended up getting promoted to lieutenant colonel, and they needed somebody to take his place as a major. And they asked me if I would be willing to do it. Still learning to do the job of a captain, but I accepted the promotion, and the rest was kind of history. I took over in 2018 as the major, and I stayed there and ran that district until I retired in 2021. So, I saw a lot of things in Baltimore. Obviously, a lot of what we see in Baltimore in police work are not, we're seeing people's worst days. We're seeing, victims of horrific crime, but a lot of good things too. Building a lot of good relationships in the community with people and just getting to know people. And really, one of my favorite things about, being a supervisor is being able to take care of the officers. I know what it was like when I was an officer.
Mhm.
And so I know firsthand what these guys are experiencing. And so being able to get into those supervisory positions, provide these guys with resources that they need to do their job, that takes a lot of stress off of them. It makes, when you talk about from a wellness standpoint, and I know we had discussed this before, but from purely a wellness standpoint, um, the majority of police officers, at least the ones that I have worked with, do not experience. I mean, we all obviously the streets can be a little stressful with the nature of the calls that we respond to, but the majority of the real stress and what really drives officers, into different states of mind are the things that go on within the house.
Mhm.
And it is the politics that tend to run through a lot of these larger departments. And for a while, back when I started, there was the whole thing about quotas and all those kinds of things. And, that stuff lived in real space. That stuff was real. And so, um, yeah, I mean, you ask most officers, I would believe that if you ask most officers, they would probably concur that most of the stress we experience on the job does not come from the street. It comes from in the house.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you. There's a few things I want to kind of circle back on and kind of dive into a little bit that I find is really interesting. So, 2001, you
Mhm.
were tossed into the lion's cage, right? Like
Yeah.
they were like, all right, like all hands
Yep.
on deck,
Hmm.
learn boots on the ground, good luck, kid. Like that was kind
Yep.
of like what happened.
Right.
And I'm curious, obviously you said that this was really challenging, and I can only imagine how challenging that must have been. Even that story of you saying you showed up an hour later, I can only imagine like the stress. Like I can feel
Yeah.
that in myself of like being like,
Yeah.
I got to get there and you can't get
Right.
there. And, and just,
Right.
um, what do you think you learned about yourself during that time? Do you think that because you had that experience where like you could only really count on you, that you learned more about like what you're capable of, and that kind of
Yeah.
was something that you could take with you through the rest of your career?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of that. I think I think every new officer that's just starting out on the job has that question kind of floating in the back of their mind, like, can I really do this? Especially when you don't have a background like a military background where you've done anything even remotely similar. You have those initial questions, and listen, we go through the police academy, and that's a very controlled environment. We're basically getting a foundation of how to do the job, but you never really know what the job entails and how to really do the job until you get out in the field. And so, yeah, I mean, that was a very trying time because I had those questions floating in the back of my mind, like, can I really do this? Is this something that I can really be good at? And then to be thrown into that situation, I think what I found out most about myself is that, wow, so I really do have the ability to work in this high stress situation and still remain somewhat composed,
Hmm.
because that is a big part of this job. This is a difficult job to do if you don't have composure.
Yeah.
And just for the basic reasons, I mean, going to a call and having people call you every name in the book and trying to maintain your cool, and you're supposed to be the keepers of peace. And
Mhm.
so we don't have the luxury of going to a call for service and somebody spits at us or somebody curses at us and we can just react back in the same manner. We can't do that. And so knowing that, the response time from call to call is just as crucial as how you handle the call when you get there. That those first, 6 to 12 months of really not knowing my way around and having to maintain my composure to, Baltimore City runs in 100 blocks. And so if you're not familiar with the north and south and the east and west of these blocks, you can find the street, but you can be completely in the wrong 100 block and you could be 3 or 4 miles from the call.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I think what you really learn is that no matter what the situation is in police work, without composure, you will never be able to survive in this job. I mean, even being 3 or 4 miles from a call that's in progress where somebody's being assaulted, that doesn't give you a license to just drive like a bat out of hell, where you can injure somebody else en route or you could kill yourself en route to the call, and you can't help anybody if you can't get to the call. Just even being able to maintain that composure, through that kind of a circumstance. And I do think I carried that through my career. I think those early lessons that I learned from those first year or two on the job, I think I took a lot of that and I kind of put it in my toolbox and carried it with me. And I think it's really helped me, along the way.
I think that when you learn that you can do hard things, then
Mhm.
you now know that you can do hard things. It kind of
Yeah.
creates that resiliency and that grit of like, okay,
Mhm.
like I've done hard things before, so I have the
Right.
confidence that I can continue to do hard things. But what you
Right.
just said to me was it's mental training, it's emotional regulation, right? It's like you said, that composure, and that's
Mhm.
really difficult. I don't know if there's anyone in the public like who
Yeah.
could, if someone came and spit on you, if they would be able to hold their composure in that way. So it takes an
Yeah.
incredible amount of emotional regulation and mental training to be able to do that. And so
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that obviously, you don't ever want someone to go through that experience where they, are just tossed in and feel like they don't have the adequate training and they're just like,
Yep.
all right, like good luck, but
Yeah.
to me it sounds
Yeah.
like because you had that experience, and to your point, how can you start to promote and how can you do better for the younger people so that there isn't anyone who feels like, man, I really don't know what's going on and I don't have anyone to help me. So it seems like that was
Yeah.
also something that kind of gave you like almost like a present that you can give to other people of like,
Yeah.
hey, like yes, it
Yeah.
helped you in a way, like of you being able to
Hmm.
like know the grit. And I'm sure that that also helped you through promotions with
Yeah.
it being so competitive, but now you have this opportunity to help other people to not be,
Yeah.
not experience what you did.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's unique. I mean, I've never spoken to an officer since then that said he's never had field training. But there is a very unique group of us that, my class was, I think we graduated about 48 of us were in my graduating class. And so the 48 of us sort of have this very unique bond that we are probably the only officers in the history of that department to never receive field training. And I think you could probably say the same for them. I mean, the fact that we all had that unique experience, and we all had to figure it out at the same time that way, where everybody else got exactly what they were supposed to get from a training standpoint.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's funny because all through my years in Baltimore, that was always a story that was well known. Class 0101 did not get field training. But the one thing that I can tell you about that class and why that class is so unique is because that class had ended up years later having majors and captains and lieutenants and sergeants that all came out of that class. It
Mm,
was it was a very it was most of the academy classes, you're getting a lot of young 20s. Our academy class, the average age of my academy class was, I think, 28. So we were considered to be an older type of class, which means that we had more life experience. We had more wisdom about life. Even though 28 is still young, it is later than people normally come onto a police department.
Sure.
And so I had my class commander in the academy was 40 when I was in the academy. So we had people in my academy class that ranged from age 23 all the way up to 42, and so we already had a maturity about us. And I think that helped us also handle that unique situation because you could have very well thrown in a group of 48, 22-year-olds into the same situations. And I don't know how that would have ended up.
Yeah.
And so we have that uniqueness about us, and I wouldn't change my career for anything. I'm glad I went through that, and I'm glad that's how things had to happen, because I think it probably, like you said before, I think it probably went a long way into making me better.
Yeah.
Just having the understanding that there's nothing you can pretty much throw at me that I wouldn't be able to figure out my way through coming off of that. You
Well, and
know.
I think too, it sounds like there was a fuel to,
Mhm.
you said you wanted to, impact change. You saw things where you're like, man, like I want to be in a position where I can do things better
Yeah.
or differently. And one of
Hmm.
the things that you said that I think stuck out to me is, as you're starting to rise through the ranks,
Hmm.
you said, I knew what these young people were going through. And
Hmm.
it's this idea of remembering where you come from because
Yeah.
sometimes that gets lost. I think that sometimes we
Hmm.
have to remind ourselves, especially if it was like we did something 10 years ago, 15 years ago, for
Yeah.
for you to say, "Hey, I was able to remember where I came from,
Hmm.
understand, what these younger men and women were going through,
Yeah.
and then show up for them as a
Hmm.
supervisor to give
Yeah.
them the resources that they need, and
Hmm.
recognizing that a lot of the stress is internal. And so,
Hmm.
I guess my
Yeah.
question for you is, as you started to enter into, a supervisory position and you were able to have, you said, kind of that bird's eye view, and
Yeah.
start to, create more change. What were
Hmm.
some of the things that you focused on to help alleviate some of that internal stress and maybe create more of a culture of wellness?
Well, I learned pretty early as a supervisor that the first thing you really have to do is you have to get buy-in from the troops, right? And if officers are working for somebody that they resent, or they're working for somebody that feels like a dictator, they are less apt to respond in a positive way. And so the first thing I really wanted to focus on was giving these guys a voice. Like, what our policies are, what our patrol strategies have been, how our investigations have gone. Being able to have meetings, regular meetings with my officers, and just say to them, hey, do you think, look, this is the objective and this is the mission, and we have to accomplish this. We don't have a choice in this. But the one thing that we do have a choice in how we approach it and how we actually go about achieving it.
Mhm.
So I have my way in my own head about how probably best to accomplish this mission. But what do you guys think? You guys are the ones out in the field. You guys are the ones that are seeing things on a regular basis, giving them a stake in sort of the game, and just allowing them to voice, hey, well, I know we have to do this, but the last few months on my post, I've been seeing X, Y, and Z. Maybe we should think about doing, or at least incorporating this into the plan. And I think by doing that, I think what it does for the overall group, is it shows, number one, that you are not coming in as a supervisor and acting like you know everything there is to know, and it's either my way or the highway.
Mhm.
You're humble enough to realize that you don't know everything, and that you actually have officers that are working for you that in certain areas have more experience than you do.
Mhm.
I was never big on traffic. I was not a traffic guy. I was, even when I was a patrol officer, I was big into narcotics. I liked being able to take drug dealers off the street that were putting the poison out there into these neighborhoods. And so that's where my focus was as a patrol officer. And so when you get into a supervisory role, you don't just get to have tunnel vision on narcotics. You have to look at the whole, enchilada, so to speak, for why crime is happening. And traffic enforcement is a big part of that. And so I may have, and I was, I guess, relatively a young sergeant by department standards, I guess you could say. I was like mid 30s, I think, when I got promoted to sergeant, maybe late 30s. But I had officers working for me that had 20 and 30 years on,
Mm,
to my at the time 10 years, or even when I got promoted to sergeant, I think I had 8 years on the department, and I literally had officers that had 20, 25, 30 years that were working for me. And so I never presented myself in a way that I was naive enough to believe that there was cops that were working for me that in certain areas of police work didn't have more knowledge than I did. And I think that's what I mean by giving people a voice. I think a lot of complaints that you hear from officers is this guy, he's just a dictator. He doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to this. He's telling us to do it this way. He doesn't even, those are the kinds of conversations that you hear sometimes in locker rooms, in police locker rooms, and out on the police lot. Like, how is this guy telling me, to do it this way when I've been doing this type of work for X amount of years and I know this works? So why not put all those guys into a group setting where you can get that feedback, and then you can kind of, once you have all that feedback, ultimately, yes, it's going to be my decision as the supervisor as to how we approach this. But if I can get that kind of feedback from my guys, there is no way that that can't be helpful to me.
mm,
And I still have the same approach to this day. The same approach to this day. I learned that very young as a sergeant, and I've had some really bad supervisors. I've had some really good supervisors, and I took a little bit from each supervisor that I had, even the bad ones, because it's like I tell my guys now, I told my guys in Baltimore, you don't completely shut off anybody, because you could have the worst supervisor in the world. The one thing that you can learn from him is how not to do things.
yeah.
And so you don't just disregard him. You watch that person and you learn, the way he's handling a squad and the way he's handling a shift. And you file that into your mental file cabinet and you say, okay, well, that's one thing that I definitely will not do when I become a supervisor. And so that is how I spent each time I ascended to a different level. I just kind of kept my mind open to that. But I always approached supervision in a way where, yes, I'm your boss. I don't have to walk around here with my chest stuck out to remind you of who I am. You know who I am, you know my rank, and you know I'm a supervisor, but I still want to hear from you.
Mm,
I don't want you to be afraid to bring me an idea. I don't want you to be afraid to tell me, hey, Sarge, or hey, LT, um, I know that you told us to do it this way, but you may want to take a look at this and maybe rethink how we do the B part of that plan. You know what I mean? I would never, and I know that, and I've had supervisors that frown on that. It is basically my way or the highway, and I've never frowned on that, and I think that's why officers, at least I believe that's why they've appreciated my style of supervision, because they will always have a voice and they always feel like they can. I've got officers now that will come into my office and talk to me about certain things, and I'm not kicking them out. I'm not telling you, hey, did you go talk to your sergeant? Did you go talk to the deputy chief? You got a good idea. I want to hear it, because the whole object of this thing is to make it better,
yeah.
right? So,
We all have our lane of how we operate and how we think, right? Like,
hmm
and the way that you think is going to be based on your past experiences, and the way I think is going to be based on mine. And
right.
I think there's so much value in being able to look, and we could just say this as like a really simple example, like, I got a cup of water here. Like, how can we look at every single angle and every single
Yeah.
perspective to try to figure out, is it
Mm.
half full or half empty? I don't know. Like, but
Right.
everyone's going to have these
hmm
different perspectives, and there's so much power and value in that.
hmm
And
hmm
I like how you positioned it, because here's what I see, and this is what I've learned through my career too, is um, as you start to enter into a position where you've kind of maybe reached the pinnacles of your career, right? Whether you're
Yeah.
in leadership or head of a company or whatever it is,
hmm
there's this maybe misconception that you have to give the illusion of perfection, right? It's
Yeah.
like, okay, I've reached the top and
Hmm.
therefore I have to be all knowing and I can't show any like cracks, like I
Yeah.
have to.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of where that comes from of like,
Yeah.
just show that you're perfect all the time and you'll get through it. And
Right.
what I've learned is that one, it's incredibly like disconnecting, right?
Mhm.
Because like no one's perfect. Perfection
Right.
is an illusion. I think it's worth
Hmm.
striving to be the best that you possibly can, but no one's
Hmm.
perfect.
Right.
And you have to have teamwork and collaboration with whatever
Hmm.
you're doing. And I think if we ask ourselves the question of what is the goal of leadership? And the goal of leadership is that you want people to follow you, right? Like you want to move everything in a positive direction,
Hmm.
whatever it is that you guys are doing. And
Yeah.
if you put yourself on a pedestal and everyone else is down here and they're like, I don't want to follow that guy, then you're never
Right.
going to make any forward trajectory ever. So there has to be partnership and collaboration for
Hmm.
everyone to move forward in a
Right.
positive way. And so the one thing I like that you said that I think is really important to know is
Mm.
you said, because I can imagine, I've never dealt with this. I have worked with people definitely that are older than me and have more experience than me, but I don't think
Yeah.
I've ever been like the leader of people
Yeah.
who, have more experience.
Yeah.
But I think that maybe the fear as like a younger leader is to walk in and feel like people don't think you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so I think that that also creates that disconnection of like, I got to puff out my chest. But
Yeah.
what you
Yeah.
said was, hey guys, I have a plan. Like I
Yeah.
actually know how I would do this. Like I've
Hmm.
thought about this and here's how
Hmm.
I would do it.
Yeah.
But I value what you have to bring to the table and I want to hear from you guys. So you're not walking in being like, what do I do? I don't know
Right.
what to do, guys, So
Right.
I think that setting that example of like, hey, like I actually have like my idea of how we
Hmm.
can move it forward, but I also
Yeah.
value your ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you were to poll police officers, they would appreciate that because I think there's officers that do have a lot of good ideas. And listen, there's all types of different officers, right? And there are officers that would make fantastic supervisors, but they just have no aspiration to be in that position.
Yeah.
And so that's the other reason why it's so important to get that feedback because this guy that I'm talking to right now, who's maybe a 15-year police veteran, I Paige, I'm telling you that I have had conversations with officers, and I have literally asked officers, why are you not taking the promotional exam? Like you should be leading, you should be a supervisor, and various reasons why people don't want the position, and I completely understand it because as I began to ascend through the ranks, like I told you, there is so much ridiculousness that you deal with on the way up, and you can kind of understand from that perspective why there's so many people that don't want to be, they just want to come to work, they want to punch the clock, they want to do their job, and they want to go home. And it's not that they don't want to see change, it's not that they don't want to affect change, it's that they don't want the stress of having to deal with everything that comes along with trying to do that. And I experienced plenty of it in Baltimore. I experienced it to a certain extent here, but I think when it comes to humbling yourself enough to, and you still have to be able to exude the confidence that, look, I actually do know what I'm doing, and I, like you said, I actually do have a plan here, and I believe that this is the right way. This is the right way to go about this to complete this mission. But I'm just not going to shut the door on that
Mhm.
because you may actually have something that would enhance my plan. Something that maybe I didn't think about in the middle of the plan. And like I said before, I think if you ask most officers, that's really all they want. They just want to be heard to an extent. Listen, these guys, the one thing that you have to remember, and I always remind myself about this, and I remind my subordinate supervisors about this, you can never walk into a room with the wrong attitude when you're dealing with grown people. These are people that are accustomed to being in charge in their homes and in their lives with their own families. They are in positions of leaderships in their household. And so imagine being the head of your household with a wife and maybe, 3 or 4 children, and you are used to calling the shots at home and used to sort of, being in that position at home. And then you come to work every day and you've got somebody like me telling you what you will and won't do. And I think if you think about it from that standpoint,
Mm.
it will force you to change your supervisory style if you are supervising like a dictator.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important in terms of the legitimate reasons why you would give your officers a voice and your subordinates a voice into things like game plans and enforcement strategies and things like that, because that allows them to feel like not that they're in charge, but it does allow them to feel, like you said, valued in to some extent, like, wow, this guy really cares about what we think.
Mhm.
And he's not just talking, but he's actually taking some of our ideas and putting them into play. So the other thing that comes out of that page that it probably indirectly, but it does come out of that is trust. And that is normally the biggest problem between um, the rank and file and when you and with the people at my level, the commanders. There is usually a level of mistrust there
Mm.
that causes that divide within the house. And so, if me as a police chief right now, if I can assemble my people and say, look, this is what I'm being told that we have to achieve in terms of the mission or the objective. This is what I'm thinking about. All right, let's have a roundtable. You guys tell me, what do you think? You know what the objective is, you know what the mission is, you know what my plan is because I just presented it to you. What do you think? Do we tweak the plan? Do we go with that? You're literally it's so hard to explain what that does for an officer. It's not just trust, it's morale, it's like the whole gamut in terms of the things that stress us out the most on this job.
Yeah.
It's being able to create that atmosphere for them, you
Yeah.
know. So
Yeah. And I think too, it's like when they feel empowered,
mhm.
they're going to start thinking in a different way. They're going to start operating in a different way too. And then it becomes a partnership. And I think about I kind of relate this to sports a lot. I think a lot of people
Mhm.
can understand that
Yeah,
mentality of like how can you work together for the betterment of the team?
yeah,
And I think
yeah,
that when everyone feels like they're equally, as valued, like maybe you're the quarterback,
yeah,
or maybe you're
yeah,
the coach, you're calling
yeah,
the plays, but like
right,
everyone on the field is just as important. It can't operate without one person there. And so
right.
when you create that team environment, I think it does move
Mhm.
things forward in a different way. I had a chief say the other day, it was interesting. This is such a small, like tiny example, and maybe everyone has a different opinion on the exact topic, but I thought it was interesting. He said that he had an open door policy, and they had a policy in place where they couldn't wear short sleeve shirts. And they had an officer walk in and he said, "Hey, chief, you trust me to make some really hard decisions, some serious decisions out on the field, like you trust me to make these decisions and that I'm going to do a good job. But I feel like I'm not trusted to make the decision on whether it's appropriate for me to wear a long sleeve or a short sleeve shirt or whatever." It was something of that nature,
Yeah,
I might maybe not explain
yeah,
it exactly right, but and the chief was like, "Yeah, like you're right. Like why, like
yeah,
if you're hot and that's going to make your day better,
yeah.
wear the short sleeve shirt. Like why do we?" And it's kind of that question of like, what are some of the things that are in place? Are there better ways? Can you empower people? Can you trust people to make certain decisions, for themselves? And so they had changed the whole policy. And we've had to do that in Arizona too, because it's hot out here. And
Mhm. Yeah,
they had a policy of no tattoos, right?
yeah.
But everyone has tattoos. And so
Hmm.
everyone who had tattoos was wearing long sleeve shirts. Well, it's 120 degrees out here. And they were like, "Hey, like, I know we made the decision to make tattoos, but we also got hired with these tattoos and we have these long shirts. We're dying out here."
Yep.
And they're like, "Okay, we're going to change the policy where you can show tattoos as long as it's not inappropriate so that you can be
Right.
comfortable." And, so it's just certain
Hmm.
things of like getting that feedback from people and then
Yes.
being willing to maybe adapt the way that you do things based on
Yeah.
that feedback. And maybe it doesn't happen every time, but to
Mm.
your point, if you listen to everyone and you do still make a different decision or whatever
Mhm.
decision you see fit, you can at
Yeah.
least now justify or you can give the why. And I think people really appreciate when they can at
Mm.
least hear why certain decisions were made. And
Right.
so I think it kind of goes back to what you said, the value and the team mentality.
Yeah. That's interesting because we had the same policy in Baltimore
Mhm.
for my first, I guess maybe my first 10 years. We literally, anybody that had tattoos, uh, not allowed to wear short sleeves.
Mhm.
And at first, they started to allow us to cover them up with, different types of things that maybe can blend into the uniform. I don't know. But then they just 86 the whole thing. And the reason that the policy got changed was because the officers started speaking up, and even some of the supervisors. I mean, I've got four tattoos,
Yep.
and it's my reasoning at the time. When this was kind of controversial, I think I was a lieutenant when it really became an issue. My reasoning to my major at that time was, how does my tattoo affect my ability to do my job? I mean, some of the people that we're dealing with on calls have tattoos. You think they're going to think
Exactly.
any less of me as an officer because I've got a tribute tattoo to my father on my arm? Like, I think finally what ended up happening is, like you said, I think some of the leadership started to question why the policy was in place in the first place, and they started to hear the feedback, and the next thing you know, rational thought begins to take hold, and you say, okay, well, yeah, why can't our officers, as long as they're not, like you said, inappropriate, we don't have pictures of, completely inappropriate images,
Yeah.
why is that a problem? And nobody could really answer the question. If we don't, nobody could really answer the question, really, to begin with why the policy started in the first place. My guess is that there was a commander a long time ago that decided that you know what, Paige? I'm a huge sports fan. You just brought up sports. This is the tattoo issue in police work. It almost in my mind directly correlates to the no facial hair issue that the New York Yankees lived by forever.
Mhm.
And they just didn't believe that it was a good look. It's not what they wanted to promote. Well, I'm guessing that there was a commander somewhere along the line that decided that police officers walking around with their tattoos out was just a bad look, but nobody could really ever explain why it was a bad look.
Mhm.
And I think that's and I do believe, and I believe this because I think I've been in police work long enough to say this. I believe that there is a pretty noticeable change in command and how police commanders are operating, how they're thinking. And I do think that there is more commanders that are welcoming that type of feedback, and not just from their subordinate supervisors, but from literally the boots on the ground, the people that are out there doing the work. I think that we're seeing more of that. And I know because I go to a chiefs meeting every month with all the chiefs from Ingham County here in Lansing, Michigan. And I can tell just by the roundtable conversations that there is a shift that's
Yeah.
happening. And it's a good shift. It's a long overdue shift, but it's happening. It's not happening overnight, but I think there is definitely a shift in the way police commanders are operating and managing their departments.
Yeah.
So I
I think it's
think,
a partnership. I think that it's important to be inquisitive and to ask questions and to, try to dissect the why, especially in not in a, because I know some people hate the why and they talk about the younger generation and the why. And I
yeah,
think that if the intention is to make things better, the
mhm,
intention is growth, then I think
mhm,
you have to challenge the way things have always been done and you have to ask,
yeah,
is there a better way to do it? But then on the
yeah,
flip side to that, and what you said just now is, as leadership, you also have to be willing to, you know, consider those
hmm,
questions. So if someone's going to
yeah,
ask a question, do you have the ability to consider it? And I think that's hard. I think that everyone agrees, like,
yeah,
it's hard to adapt or to
mhm,
change or to have like an open mind to, completely uprooting something that's always been done, but I think
Yeah.
it's a strength if you are always teachable, if you have a
Hmm.
learner's mindset, if you have a growth mindset, and you're
Hmm.
open to feedback and suggestions, and you're open to considering the questions and the why.
Yeah.
I think that it's a strength,
Mm.
not a weakness. So
Yeah.
I agree with you. I've only been in the space for 8 years, but
Mm.
when I first started, the
Hmm.
attitude towards wellness with leadership was much different than it is now. And
Yeah.
the conversations are so much different. I have
Mm.
like I remember in the beginning it was really hard to have conversations, and I was almost like I don't want to say scared. I was intimidated, it was like
Yeah.
very much like I am this person and like
Yeah.
closed off. And now
Hmm.
I'm having these conversations where it's like, wow, like you guys are human and you're actually like willing to show that. It's really
Yeah.
cool to have these like,
Yeah.
and now like I'm more afraid of walking into a briefing with a bunch of patrol officers than I am talking to the chief because I'm like more intimidated by that for some reason. But
Yeah. Yeah.
one of the things that you said to me that was really powerful that I wanted to bring up, and I was hoping you could maybe share your perspective on this, is kind of going back to the human side of things, and
Hmm.
you said the goal is to keep the parts of you that make you you outside of
Yeah.
the job. And
Hmm.
I know that, I've had this conversation before where a lot of people do feel like they maybe lose pieces of themselves
Hmm.
to the
Yeah.
career. How
Hmm.
can you keep those parts of you that make you who you are
Yeah.
outside of what you do?
Yeah, that's something else I kind of had to learn along the way, because this job really can sort of suck you in, and it can make it this job has the ability to make you feel like you have to be 24/7 police, and you never have the ability to just be you at any given moment. And it is interesting because even when you leave work and you go home, regardless of how much you try to hide it, people in your neighborhood, people around where you live, they know you're a cop, and so it is very difficult to keep work and home separate. But the way I've always approached it, and I tell my officers this also, there is no police handbook that says that if you like to fish before you became a cop, that now that you're a cop, you can't fish anymore. You know what I mean? There's nothing written anywhere that says just because you're a police officer means that you can't still have a date night with your wife, or you can't go to the movies anymore. That was something you liked to do and you enjoyed doing before you became a cop. I just talked to a graduating academy class. I think it was like a month and a half ago, and I told them the same thing. The one thing that you have to remember is that you can't allow this job to dictate who you are 24/7. And it's not to say that you don't have to, be weary of your profession, and realize that you may arrest somebody at work and you might bump into that person at the mall a month later. So you do have to pay attention, but it doesn't mean you can't go anywhere. If you enjoyed going to museums and that was a hobby for you before you became a cop, why would you stop just because you became a cop? I mean, we tell our guys all the time that because of what you do have to be mindful of the things that you do off duty, because you could get yourself into trouble off duty just as well as you can on duty. Because there's policies, there's departmental policies that tell you certain things about your off duty life, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do anything. And I think for me, um, I knew that before I became a police officer, I loved to fish and I loved to play sports and I loved to play softball. I was in softball leagues, and I loved baseball, and I loved, being able to go places with my wife and just hang out. And so all of these things that I enjoyed doing before I became a cop, after I became a cop, one of the things that I always told myself is that I am going to fight until my last breath to keep my work life here and my home life here, and not mix the two. And the easiest way for me to achieve that was to make sure that I stayed consistent with the things I enjoyed doing before I decided to go into this profession. I still do it today. I have certain things that I love to do when I'm off duty that have nothing to do with police work, and I'll probably never stop doing them. But if there is anything that I can tell young officers, like I told that academy class, it's that. Because mixing the two is where officers get in trouble. There's no secret. I mean, everybody knows that we have an extremely high divorce rate in this profession. We have a high suicide rate in this profession. Um, I believe it, and we have a high rate now of mental health issues in this profession, alcoholism in this profession. I believe that a lot of the things that drive us to those places is because we don't understand how to keep the two separate. We don't understand how to have a home life and how to have a work life, how to have a career, and how to maintain a good home life, a healthy home life. And because those two things seem to get jumbled with a lot of officers, it leads to a lot of the things that we read about, and it leads to a lot of the statistics that we see in this profession. And so I've always been mindful of it. I'm mindful of it still. I have a wife who reminds me of it every once in a while, if I go off track. But it's even I think it's even more important to do that once you begin to have a family, because you can really do some destruction. It's different when it's just you. If it's just you and you're living the lives, mixed together, and that's one thing. But when your stuff starts to affect, the members of your family, that could be a lot more detrimental. So I try to keep that message fresh with any of these young guys that I talk to, of how important that is.
Yeah, I love those words of advice. And
Mm,
um, I know we're butting up here on time, so
mm,
you've already given so many words of wisdom for the younger generation, also in the context of leadership. But I still have to ask the final question in case you want to add anything else in there. But what words of wisdom would you share either with younger people who are wanting to enter into leadership roles or the
mhm.
younger generation who are entering into the profession today? What words of wisdom would you share that maybe you wish you would have known earlier, or maybe a piece of advice that helped you that you want to pass on to them?
I would say if there's one thing that I would, you can specifically to people entering into my field, but I guess in general, the one thing that I would say is don't, especially in this profession, don't come into this profession looking at this as a job. You have to approach this as a career. And I think sometimes as young people, we tend to approach these kinds of things as jobs, and we treat it like a job. And you do treat a job and a career differently.
Mm,
A job, you come in, you punch the clock, you do your job, and you go home. But there's not a lot of caring in there. There's not a lot of empathy that goes with approaching something like that. When you are looking at something as a career, there is something different in terms of your focus and your objectives and the meaning of what that means to you. There is something different about approaching something as a career. And that is especially true in police work. I would tell anybody, you cannot come into this profession thinking of this as a job, because you will not be a good cop. You will not be somebody that people will want to communicate with, because you are solely focused on punching the clock.
mm,
And if all you're doing is trying to come here to punch a clock and get a decent paycheck and get some decent benefits out of it, there is a million other jobs that you can do where you can do that, and it won't affect the amount of people that it could potentially affect if you come in here with that attitude. And so that's really what I would. And I did, Paige, learn that at a very early stage in my career. And it was, funny enough, it was my father that reminded me of that. You're not in a position where you can look at what you're doing as just a job, because it could potentially affects too many other people, as many people as we contact every day. The decisions that we make affect other people's lives in profound ways that maybe we don't think twice about because we're bouncing call to call, but we have no idea. It's so funny because I remember um, the first time somebody approached me off duty and said, "You're Officer Gaines." And I said, yeah. And obviously, I didn't know who this person was. I mean, especially in a place like Baltimore where you're coming in contact with hundreds of people every day. But what I didn't realize was that I was the first police officer that individual had ever
Mm,
engaged with. And because of how I treated him, he went out of his way when I was off duty to approach me and to thank me for whatever I did for him. I honestly, I wasn't even aware because I didn't even remember this guy.
mm,
But that is the reason that you can't approach this just as a job,
mm.
because the effect that you can have on, if one person has one police interaction in their whole life and it's a bad interaction, all of us pay for it.
Yeah.
Because now that person hates police and he doesn't care who's inside of the unit, he just hates the uniform. And when you approach it like a job, you're going to have a tendency to treat people less than what you should be treating them, because you're just focused on the clock and you're focused on your check and you're focused on your benefits. So approach it as a career. It will allow you to keep reserving space for empathy, for fairness, equitability, um, and it will keep you open-minded when you're dealing with certain people on certain calls. It'll force you to learn different cultures. This police work doesn't say you're only going to deal with middle class communities. You're only going to deal with upper class communities or lower income communities. You are going to deal with everybody,
Mm,
and which means that you should probably be familiar with the people that you're serving in your community, which means, hey, maybe you should be familiar with the Sabbath.
yeah.
Maybe you should be familiar with African American holidays or, whatever. I mean, whoever you're serving, you should have an idea of what they deal with on a day-to-day basis and the things that make them comfortable. So I would say that you'll get all of that if you approach it from a career aspect rather than just a job aspect. And if I was going to tell anybody anything, it would be that, especially coming into this profession and even going into a position of leadership.
Yeah,
So,
I love
yeah.
that framing. I think that that's so cool. And
Mhm.
I've done almost 300 interviews and I've never had anyone say that. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
No, no problem.
I know I took more time than I asked, so thank you so much for coming on
Um,
here with me today. I really appreciate your time.
yeah, I enjoyed the conversation. Absolutely.
Thank you.